a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I helped out a guy a while ago, a couple months, and in payment, he gave me a gift card from that coffee company that has a fish for their symbol. I used to like their coffee a lot, drank it all the time, until I found Organic Man Coffee Trike. The taste in my cup went from good coffee to wow, this is the best coffee in the universe. 4501 McPherson has the best coffee because that's where you'll find Organic Man Coffee Trike. If it's just too far to drive, you don't own a helicopter, you can go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Life is too short to drink bad coffee. Quando omni fluncus moritati. I got the idea for tonight's show from Vic Hermanson. He sent me a whole bunch of ideas, and I'm working my way through. His show, Trailer Trash Terrors, is back after a brief hiatus. Sick relatives and unfinished business. Unfortunately, life sometimes gets in the way of us doing the things that we want to. Funny thing about doing a podcast, I must be really out of step with most people. The shows that I had to force myself to do, the ones I thought, well, this is not going to be good, are the shows that most people liked. Then the shows that I thought, all right, I nailed this one. I've got a show here that everybody's going to like. Well, those were the shows that had the worst reviews. So apparently, I don't know what people want. But I'm not going to change how I do things. Fear is a tricky thing. It is actually our friend, keeping us from doing too many stupid things. Fear is what makes a police officer walk slowly and keep his eyes on the things around him. It makes a soldier more cautious. It is what lets us know there's something not right. Fear is also a weapon for those who want to keep us hiding under our beds. Certain folks bombard us with scary things, so we're so focused on fear, we miss what they're actually doing. I wonder when the TV news folks will stop with all of the monkeypox, bird flu, mermaid scabies, and nose hair fairies. Stop trying to instill fear and get back to informing or entertaining us. There's also the fear that our sixth sense picks up on. When a soldier knows he's walking into a trap or an ambush, not because of anything visible, but because of a gut feeling that nobody can explain. That feeling a nurse gets that one of her patients or his patients is in need of help when the call button hasn't even been pushed. There's also the fear we get from hearing a scary story. The boys in the white lab coats have been studying fear for a long time. They want to know why we get scared and why are so many of us in love with it. Just look at horror movies and scary novels. Why do we love those things? I liked the Blair Witch Project. I know a lot of folks who thought it was poorly made and the imaging was bad and there was very little acting and they just didn't like it. I liked the movie because it was different. No teenagers running around being offed by some guy in a hockey mask. No CGI, no special effects. Surprisingly, there was very little blood. I also liked The Ring, the US version, not the one from Japan. I saw both. A horror movie should make you uneasy once the show is over, when you're alone in the dark. A really good horror movie is, unfortunately, a movie you can only actually watch once because the second time around it loses its bite. What made Jaws so fantastic was you hardly ever saw Bruce. The mechanical shark broke down shortly after filming began, and the director had to fill in a lot of the scenes with just scary music and unseen attacks. The Mind is far better horror movie than the silver screen. We fill in the missing monsters with our own imagination. Fear is one of our deepest and strongest emotions, and one which best lends itself to the creation of nature defying illusions. That's a quote, and I really screwed it up. Fear is one of our deepest and strongest emotions, and the one which best lends itself to the creation of nature defying illusions. And I didn't write down who that quote is from. I've read a few horror novels that made a long lasting impression on me. The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher is one. A young woman discovers a strange portal in her uncle's museum. Venturing into another realm along with a guy from the coffee shop, she discovers a really bizarre and spooky world. Just so you'll know, there is a guy, and it's the guy from the coffee shop, who likes to dress like a female. Well, if you can't handle that kind of thing, don't read the book. If that kind of thing doesn't bother you, it's a good story. I highly recommend it. Kept me awake at night. Just one of those things. I don't see how the book would have been any better without the guy. Why do folks like to get scared? What is it about us humans that we go looking for things that make us uneasy? A movie came out, The House on Haunted Hill, with Vincent Price, the original, not the remake. An eccentric millionaire named Frederick Loren and his wife, Annabelle, have invited 5 people to a house for a one night, and they will win $10,000 apiece if they can spend the entire night there. Uh, Ghosts, murders, all kinds of terrible things happen. The movie was based on a few actual weird places here in the US. I tried to find a connection to England, but as far as I know, there isn't one. Number 50, Berkeley Square, was constructed in 1740 by William Kent. Many important people stayed there, including Winston Churchill and George Canning. Nobody knows when the building got its terrifying reputation, but the first incident is supposed to have happened in the late 17th century. From there, things just kept escalating through the 1800s. Newspaper reports began calling this building disturbed, haunted, and inhabited by something truly demonic. Famed architect William Kent designed this 4-story townhouse in 1740. In 1789, a young woman named Adeline jumped out of a window from the top floor. She had been living there with her uncle, who was not a nice man. Rumors abound of some of the nasty things that he had done. Immediately after her death, people began to see a young woman in the window that Adeline had jumped from. The folks making these sightings said they saw a woman leaning out of the fourth floor window just before she jumped and plummets to the ground. Some of these folks also said they saw what looked like a man standing behind her who pushed the young woman to her death. They believed that this was her uncle. These sightings went on for years after her death. There's a story concerning a Dr. Dupree of Wilton Park from the late 1700s. He somehow either acquired the house or was simply renting a part of it and had his insane brother locked up in one of the rooms. This was the same room all the fun and horror took place in. This story's repeated on many web pages, but I'm not sure if it's true or just passed on as a cool story. Back then, if you had money, you didn't send your weird relatives to the hospital. You locked them away from the public. The insane brother is supposed to have become the monster or the being after he died. In 1827, the townhouse became home to George Canning, the short-lived Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. During his time living at the townhouse, Canning told people close to him he had heard strange noises in the night, and he experienced some really wild nightmarish dreams, but he feared talking out in the open about them. Canning moved out of the house, and it was sold to a Mrs. Curzon. She hired a man to run the place and began renting out rooms to anyone in need of a room for the night or for a month or two. As people came and went, stories began to spread about weird things seen and heard in the house, especially one of the second floor bedrooms, as well as the very top floor of the building. In 1840, 20-year-old Sir Robert Warboys showed up with more courage, fueled by alcohol, than sense. Robert had heard of the stories of ghosts and monsters that resided in the house, and he was there to disprove them and to prove his own courage. He insisted on being allowed to spend the night in the worst room they had. Although the landlord attempted to discourage him, he soon relented. The landlord wanted Robert to be prepared, so he handed this young man a single-shot pistol, and he told him that there was a bell in the bedroom on the second floor. If anything were to go wrong, he should ring the bell immediately, and the landlord would come to his aid. In other reports, Robert had brought the pistol from his own home. It's unclear which is the real story. Robert agreed, scoffing at the idea of such accommodations, and proceeded to the second floor. An hour later, just past midnight, a shrill clanging of the desperate bell rang throughout the house. A moment later, the landlord heard the sound of the pistol being fired. He rushed up to the second floor, opening the door to what looked to be an empty room. The landlord began looking for the wayward guest. He found him curled up in the corner. The man was very much dead. His face had what could only be described as a look of absolute horror frozen on it. The pistol was still clutched in one hand after having been fired, but there was no bullet hole in any of the walls. As for why Robert Warboys was so intent on spending the night in a haunted house, he had taken a wager from Lord Cholmondeley and John Benson, who happened to live on Berkeley Square. Robert was to win 100 guineas, which I tried to convert to today's dollars, and I came up with a really ridiculous amount. Let's just say it was a fairly big wager. Robert had to spend the night in the haunted room, and by sunup he would walk away with a huge handful of cash. Either to add to his concerns or his friends were actually worried about him, Robert was armed with a bell to raise the alarm if he saw anything and a pistol for further protection. Now, was he given the pistol for his protection, or was this just to add to his tension? The other two men would spend the night on the first floor to make sure that Robert didn't sneak out and then return before the sun was up. Upon hearing the bell ringing and the pistol being fired, his companions rushed to his aid, only to find Sir Robert laying on the floor by the bed after dying of fright. Depending on which version of the story you read, the outcome is always the same. At the coroner's inquest, it was decided that Robert Warboys had died from fright. After the death of Warboys, the townhouse was said to be locked up and nobody stayed there for a while. After this incident, neighbors reported hearing a medley of strange sounds emanating from the haunted house. Bumps on the stairs, dragging noises as if something heavy were being moved around. A jangling of the signal bells for the servants could be heard through the windows. They also heard somebody tromping up and down the stairs. On a few occasions, extra brave or probably foolhardy neighbors would investigate these sounds. Anyone entering the house would find no evidence of anyone having been there or anything inside that could have been making all the noise. 1843. Two drunken sailors were wandering the streets looking for some place to crash. They were stationed aboard the HMS Penelope and had arrived in London from the West Indies. After the pair had spent all their money on alcohol and women of negotiable affections, they were in no shape to walk back to their ship. They were in need of some place to sleep it off. It was a cold night. Seeing an old abandoned house, they decided this would do in a pinch. Robert Martin and Edward Blunden jumped the fence and then kicked in the front door. Hoping to avoid any run-ins with the police, they headed up to the top floor. At some point in the night, they were awakened by the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. At first, they thought it was a constable, having seen or been told of the break-in. The sounds grew louder, until whoever it was had arrived just outside their door. As the door swung open, the two men saw something slithering into the room. Martin was able to dive out the door past the thing. Blunden was trapped in the room. Martin ran down the street until he found a constable. He begged the officer to come help his shipmate. The constable was suspicious of Martin since he reeked of alcohol, but finally the officer followed the drunken sailor back to the house. Martin led the constable up to the top floor, but Blunden was nowhere to be found. It took a while to finally find the other sailor. His body was found in the basement. It had been torn to pieces. Martin was arrested for the murder, but the police could find no evidence of cause or why he would have killed his own friend. After word of the two sailors' encounter, people began to report seeing glimpses of a grayish blob passing by the windows at night. With no one in the townhouse, the paint began to chip and the grime began to build up on the windows, and the years began to take their toll on the house. What was once a fashionable home was quickly turning into a disaster. When Miss Curzon died, the house was bought by a strange man named Thomas Myers. He had been engaged to Mary, and at the last second his soon to be wife decided he was not the man of her dreams. Maybe nightmares, but she said, "No way, Jose." Some say this sudden rejection drove him over the edge. Others say this was why his fiancée had run. And now, living alone, Myers began acting even more strange. To begin with, few folks ever saw him during the daylight hours. He was only ever seen outside his home at night. Anyone running into Myers said he would make strange noises when they saw him. His bizarre behavior began to scare people. Folks would see him standing by a window, looking out as if keeping an eye on them. As time passed, he just got weirder and weirder. 1873, Myers had stopped paying his taxes. This led to the city coming down on him. When all the notices sent by mail were simply ignored, the city sent a taxman around to have a face-to-face. The tax assessor was shocked at the dilapidated state the house was in. Myers had no staff to look after things, and so the yard and the exterior were in sad state. Instead of fining Myers, the city dropped their appraisal down to nothing. His house looked as if it was worth less than it would have cost to tear it down. Myers died the following year, and the house was left to his sister. Due to the neglect and the level of disrepair the house was in, she decided to stay at her own house and wait to see what might be done to number 50. Folks still had a hard time believing the stories. Word would spread about a monster living in the old building, and many decided that this was just uneducated or drunken stories. Lord George Lyttelton, Lyttelton, yeah, it's one of those names, Lyttelton, wanted to spend the night in the attic of the townhouse. Despite him telling everybody who would listen that he thought the whole monster story was just garbage, he insisted on bringing a shotgun with him just in case. When I go in the woods, I don't carry a pistol because I might run into a dogman or Bigfoot. I carry because we have some nutcases running around who might think they're one or the other. I hope, if I ever do run into a cryptid, it is corporeal enough for hot lead to have some kind of damaging effect on it. Otherwise, I'm in deep trouble. That night, George saw something creeping towards him in the dark. He fired his shotgun at what he described as a brown, tendrilled, misty apparition. After the smoke of his blast dissipated, he found nothing there. It had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He later told folks that number 50 Berkeley Square was supernaturally fatal to body and mind. 4 years later, George killed himself by throwing himself down a flight of stairs. The story goes he never recovered from the trauma of that supernatural encounter. A big house in the heart of London was still a prize, even if it was falling down. With enough money and a lot of manpower, the house was put back into livable shape. In 1879, a man and his two teenage daughters moved in. The eldest of the daughters complained of a musty, zoo like smell coming from the top floor. This was written off as being just the aftermath of the house having been empty for so long. Captain Kentfield was the fiancé of the oldest daughter, and he was going to spend the night in their house. A maid was sent upstairs to prepare a room for him on the top floor. Minutes later, they heard a loud scream pierce the air. The family rushed up and they found the maid in the center of the room, nearly comatose, repeating over and over, "Don't let it touch me." The family, probably with the help of other servants, carried the young girl down to the parlor. Once there, she continued saying, "Don't let it touch me," and holding her arms across her body. She appeared to have lost her mind and never explained what it was. She was sent off to the hospital, where she died the next day. The cause of death was listed as some kind of unknown trauma. Despite this, Captain Kentfield believed himself to be above whatever frightened the maid, and he claimed that without fear he would spend the night in that room. His screams also pierced through the home several minutes later. The family found him just like they had found the maid, except they were too late for him. His face was contorted and twisted in terror. It was determined that he, too, had died of fright. With all the incidents in the home, wasn't long before investigators and others wanted to experience or explain these strange happenings. There's an account of a spiritualist society that wanted to perform either an exorcism or a seance, which are opposites of each other, at the place, but they were never allowed in. Another investigator was arrested for trying to break in. He was quite thoroughly drunk when he attempted to enter the house, having he boosted his courage with alcohol. As more people tried to show how courageous they were, or to simply see what all the fuss was about, word spread far and wide on the thing at number 50 Berkeley Square. People living in the neighborhood or simply passing by on the street said they saw white, misty apparition, either at the windows on the top floor or jumping or falling from the top of the building. This was credited to being Adeline, the young girl who had jumped or was pushed from the window. People began seeing the ghosts of a little girl walking or skipping around the yard, sometimes on the sidewalk just outside of the fence. The sighting of some kind of a horrible creature was also being talked about. Accounts of the thing date back as far as the early 1840s, though nobody is exactly sure when the first confirmed sighting was. Some said the thing was found in the basement, while others said it roamed freely throughout the building. The shape did change from time to time. Most said it was kind of like a shadowy creature with long tentacles. It made a wet, slithering sound as it moved. Others said it walked on two legs like a man, but it had the body of a monster with many long tentacles. The creature had been described as an amorphous being, formless and slimy. While accounts conflict regarding the actual shape and size of this thing, At least one eyewitness was said to have seen the tentacles in his description of the creature, likening the beast to a small, viciously deformed octopus, which had pulled itself across the floor, leaving a viscous trail in its wake. This specter was described as a man ghost with an unbelievably ghastly face. A face white and flabby, with a huge gaping mouth black as pitch. Others have said that it was an animal creature with many legs and tentacles, a monstrous thing which looked like it might have crawled from the London sewers. Some say it's a shapeless being composed of depthless shadows, and as a shapeless and slimy, emitting gruesome slopping noises. One thing only did all the witnesses agree on. It was evil being that wished death upon anyone found in its domain. Neighbors reported sightings of strange creatures, bad smells, and sounds in the night that were attributed to this unknown creature. During the 1930s, the Maggs brothers bought this building, number 50, and they opened up an antique dealership. Since then, there have not been any reports of anything sinister going on in the house. Nobody is permitted to use the top floor of the property for unknown reasons. Reports suggest that a notice has been posted to remind the staff not to venture further upstairs. No phenomenon has been reported since the house was bought by the Maggs brothers, and though many contemporary media outlets have reported happenings in the house, more recent investigators claim that nothing unusual has happened there in the 1900s. However, in January 1937, a Mary Balfour, an 80-something-year-old lady, moved into an apartment. In England, they call them flats. The apartment was on Charles Street, which is one block over, but it backs up to Berkeley Square. Late one evening, Miss Balfour's maid asked her to come to the kitchen at the rear of the apartment. The maid was staring out the window at the back of the house opposite. It was the rear of number 50. The maid pointed out to Mrs. Balfour one of the rear windows. A man stood there dressed in a silver colored coat and pants. He wore an old style wig, something from the 1700s, and he had a drawn and morose ashen face. The two women thought that maybe he had been to some New Year's Eve fancy dress party, because his clothes were centuries out of date. The man moved away from the window, and Mrs. Balfour and her maid lost sight of him. Later, the next day, they heard from a doctor they had sighted one of the ghosts of number 50 Berkeley Square. The doctor told them that the house was currently unoccupied, but that workmen in the building 2 months earlier had seen the phantom of a little girl standing on the stairs. She had vanished as soon as they saw her. Stories of the haunted house continue to circulate today as folks have seen a face looking out of the top floor window and a little girl skipping around the front yard. But nobody actually inside the building has reported anything. The story of number 50 Berkeley Square kind of ran out there. In order to fill out the hour, I thought of talking about a few haunted sites here in Texas. I got to thinking, the number 50 isn't really so much haunted, it seems to be something else. Some kind of a bizarre creature is hanging out in the house, and it doesn't sound or act like a ghost. Then they've had ghost sightings in the house, as well as other weird phenomena. This led me to looking for stories that were both frightening but not necessarily ghost stories. I remembered something a friend of mine had told me way back when I was writing the Laredo Paranormal Research Society book. I have talked about the Laredo Beast a few times in the past. I would say it was scary and exciting for the folks involved. So here it is again. Back in 2010, when I still had a job, the funnest thing we did was called sign cutting. This is a skill unique to the Border Patrol. You won't find it in any other law enforcement units, except maybe the Navajo Rangers. I don't remember ever hearing Jonathan Dover talk about sign cutting. I'll bet they do it. Maybe I just haven't heard about it. This is far from just a plain skill. It's more like an art form. You're either really good at it or you're not. There's hardly any in between. One time we were following a group and they led us into a three-way corner between three huge ranches. There, the footprints simply quit. They were on one side of the fence, but they weren't on the other. Both sides of the fences had really nice wide roads so the ranchers could check out the fences and so we could check out the aliens. The footprints led right up to the fence, but they weren't on the other side. We began sweeping back and forth, trying to figure out what had happened. Now, aliens do sometimes climb onto a fence and then shuffle along the wires for a long enough distance to escape our eyes. But these folks didn't do that. In a frustrated last minute bid to find them, one of my partners finally found the tracks out in the brush, walking along as if nothing had happened. We did eventually catch the group, and I asked a few of them some questions. It turned out, once the group had walked over the tire tracks, the last guy in the bunch had used a stick to redraw the tire impressions. He was quite an artist. Well, enough of that story, and now for the scary part. Sign cutting is a form of tracking used to find groups of people crossing the border and proceeding towards the interior of the U.S. It sounds a lot easier than it actually is. The people leaving the tracks don't want to be found, so they try to disguise their trail through bizarre means. Sometimes they'll walk backwards for a mile or two, brushing their tracks out with a branch, covering their shoes with material so they don't leave behind footprints. To a good sign cutter, these are just mere distractions. You're not just looking at tracks, you're looking at other things. Not going to tell all of it because I don't want our secrets to be out there for the bad folks. Agent Eduardo C. was working the evening shift. I could probably give his name because he's been on the show a few times, but I'm a bit hesitant about it right now. He's still working for a living. Eduardo C. was working the evening shift when he spotted sign of a group of 6 people crossing Mines Road from west to east. He drove his Tahoe along the road to determine the direction of travel so he could alert other agents working the area. The group looked like what we would call brushwalkers. These are folks who are willing to walk through the ranches and farms scattered around the border area en route to hoped for employment in the U.S. Sometimes they have been known to walk hundreds of miles. sleeping where they stopped and eating what they were carrying. They're not to be mistaken for smugglers, traveling the same routes, carrying large parcels of illegal drugs. Simply looking at the sign left from their passing, there is little hope of knowing which kind of a customer you're going to run into until you actually run into them. Other agents gathered in the area, and they got out and proceeded walking out the sign. This meant they had left their vehicle, and they were out on foot, walking through the mesquite and the ratama bushes, following the trail created by the aliens. While working sign in this way, you have to use stealth. No flashlights, no noise. If the smugglers know you're on their trail, they will use any means to escape. This includes shooting at the agents. Eddie began driving through the ranch, trying to get ahead of the group. By getting part of the search party in front and the agents on foot coming up behind, they could catch and determine whether the group were just decent folks looking for work or smugglers who would lie, steal, cheat, even kill in an attempt to deliver their illicit cargo. Eddie spotted two females running towards his vehicle. They looked haggard and uneasy as they hurried in his direction. Most brushwalkers know if they get in trouble, either sickness or they're lost, the Border Patrol will aid them, including bringing much needed medical help to the scene. Eddie is also a paramedic as well as being an agent. The women told Eddie there was something chasing them. Eddie had worked this area numerous occasions. There are cattle in most of the fields, but cows will shy away from anybody walking through the pastures. Coyotes run over every square foot of this part of Texas, but they tend to avoid human contact. Mountain lions will certainly chase down anything or anyone that they think they can have a meal out of, but you won't know you're being followed by a giant cat until it's too late. Eddie asked the women what they were afraid of. The two women informed him something big, big as an elephant, had been on their trail for the last half hour. They had seen this huge black shape following behind them, so the group had run for some time. When exhaustion set in, the group had found a thick clump of brush in which to take refuge. They could hear this creature moving through the darkness as it circled their position. When one of the women caught sight of the green and white vehicle driving along the fence, the women had taken it upon themselves to seek out the safety of an armed agent over a group of unarmed men. The men soon joined the women. They told the same story. Something big had been pursuing them through the night. The group were more than happy to jump in the back of the vehicle and get away from their unknown adversary. When it was determined the group were not carrying any drugs and had not been deported, they were all returned to Mexico, taking their chilling story with them. Having worked the brush for over 26.5 year career, I've seen some odd things. You hear sounds all around in the darkness. If you let your imagination run wild, you might just convince yourself there are monsters lurking in every arroyo. Only if you're that kind of person. The brushwalkers have spent most of their lives living, working, sleeping, and eating in the countryside. These people are not city folks. They know what is out there, usually. So, for them to have imagined this adventure is highly unlikely. Why they need to be believed, what they need to be believed, would be for others to corroborate their story. 2011, just east of the first encounter. A group of OTMs, other than Mexican. This is an official designation for aliens who are not from Mexico. Well, at least it was when I was in the patrol. God knows what they call them today. That's not politically correct, darn it. This group of 2 men and 3 women were traveling through the ranch just to the east of where the 6 had been chased last year. The OTMs had crossed the ranch very close to where the others had their bizarre encounter. At some point in their travels, something began following them. They became aware of the sound as whatever it was broke branches as it passed behind them. The aliens thought at first it might be a bull, but in the dim light they spotted what looked like a large, hair-covered creature, somewhat like a gorilla, only much bigger, maybe as big as an elephant, crashing through the brush as it moved around their position. The group were overcome with fear, not knowing what the darkness might have for them. They sought the safety of a thick clump of mesquite, and they tried to hide. The creature began to circle their position. It would move around them, never getting close enough for a very clear sighting, but always staying close enough to keep them trapped in the mesquite. Imagine the fear as they lay there in the dark, watching as this tall black form would pass in front of them and then behind them. They had no means of defending themselves. Eddie was working the same area when he saw the sign of these 5 people crossing the fence from one ranch to the next. He followed them, opening any gates as he would have to advantage of having his vehicle if a chase took too long. As he was driving along the dirt road looking for the group, they spotted him and came running. It dawned on Eddie that this looked a lot like what had happened the year before. Aliens becoming overwhelmed with fear after being chased by something through the brush. He asked the group for details of their encounter. He questioned them apart from each other. He figured they must have gotten their story from the last group. Even among people who crossed the border illegally, there's a kind of a pecking order, a hierarchy. You have the smugglers, who consider everybody else subhuman and not to be trifled with. If an alien in the group gets too sick to continue, the smugglers have been known to walk off and leave them to die on their own. Smugglers have even stolen all the possessions of the people in their company, abandoning them in the middle of nowhere with no food or water. The brushwalkers are decent people who are just passing through looking for work, but they don't associate with folks that are not from their hometown very much. The same bunch of people will travel, live, and work together the entire time they're in our country. Then there's the OTMs. Not being native to Mexico, they're not treated well by the authorities and most of the inhabitants of Mexico. The police have been known to arrest folks from South and Central America, take all their money, and then throw them out of the country. If the United States is the closest border, they'll throw them into our country. Chances are the first group would not have spent time conversing with the second group. The 2 encounters must have been factual as to what the people really thought had occurred. I wasn't there, I don't know for sure, but I have no reason to doubt Eddie. Is there some kind of a giant black hair covered thing haunting the ranches to the northwest of Laredo? Each year, science discovers new, unknown creatures living in places where everybody thought they had gone over thoroughly. Only time will tell if this thing is ever seen again. Perhaps it has been seen, but the people that saw it were too afraid to tell anyone because they didn't like the idea of being ridiculed by those people. I think that maybe the Border Patrol should track this thing down and pin a badge on it. It seems to be making a good agent of itself, running two groups to the ground and then keeping them there until our agents could get to the scene. Can you imagine that ceremony? Anytime I can, I ask folks if they have had any sightings, UFOs, cryptids, ghosts, anything strange. I get a lot of stories from people, and I do my best to write what they tell me. I type up their stories and then I return it to them in the form of a draft so they can okay what I have written, make any corrections. On occasion, the email has gone back and forth a dozen times. They'll read their own story, which might trigger memories, and so they'll add to it a little bit, or they'll change something that they don't like the way it sounds. But eventually, I'll get it to a point that they'll say, yes, that's what happened, and I'll put it in one of my books. If you happen to have a story that you'd like to see in print, send it to strange things at arkanasa.com. Sometimes the stories I get are not what I'm looking for. Strange, yes, but what I was expecting, far from it. When Janet was about 8 years old, she had a bizarre encounter with a very weird looking creature. It stuck in her mind, being memorable and bizarre. She awoke at 7 a.m. to get ready for school. Her family lived in a two-bedroom apartment with the bathroom in between the two rooms. She was standing at the sink when she saw what looked like a rat poking its head around the doorframe. What made it so odd was this creature looked two-dimensional. It also looked more like a crayon drawing of a rat instead of a living creature. The rat was an extreme shade of black that stood out in the darker room. Its eyes glowed bright red. Janet and the rat stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The rat made a squeaking sound which jarred Janet out of her state. She let go with a scream and then ran for her bedroom. Her mother was in her room setting out her school clothes. The young girl was inconsolable. Between sobs, she told her mother what she had just seen in the bathroom. Her mother thought it would be a good idea to keep her daughter home from school that day. Then her mother called Janet's aunt, who then called Janet's grandmother. The family arrived at the apartment within the hour. The grandmother prayed over the young girl and then she did an egg cleansing. Some of y'all might not know what an egg cleansing is. It involves an egg and a lot of prayer. You roll the egg over your entire body while praying. During the whole process, Janet said she felt dizzy and sick, and she could hardly stay upright. Once the cleansing was finished, the egg was taken into the kitchen, cracked on the counter, and dumped into a glass of water. What came out of the egg shell was not what anyone was expecting. The sight nearly caused the grandmother to pass out. The family decided they'd best keep the results away from Janet for the next several years. When Janet was 13, she was finally told what had come from the cleansing. The egg had been cracked and dropped into a glass of water. It looked like a spider web, and there was blood in the water as well. Apparently, black animals with red eyes have been following the women of Janet's family for generations. Her great-grandmother had seen a black cat that was described as being very similar to the rat. Her grandmother had seen a black dog also with bright red eyes. When Janet's mother was pregnant with Janet, she had seen a black cat also with glowing red eyes. Since finding out about these sightings of black animals in her family, Janet has developed a fondness for the occult. This led to her looking into witchcraft. With 6 years of practice now, she's been combing her family's history looking for other black animal sightings and what they might mean. None of her other family members or cousins have reported any bizarre animal sightings yet. Janet says that she hopes these animals are benevolent, but she has a suspicion that they probably aren't. If my wife is watching, I'll be coming straight home after the meeting. If you've never watched Red Green, maybe you should check him out. You just might learn something or at least get a good laugh. He did 300 shows, and they're all available on YouTube. Get your hands on the handy man's secret weapon. Quando omni fluncus moritati. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.